Well, hello, and welcome to this online discussion about the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China, which was held last month, and what it tells us about the future direction of the party, of its General Secretary, Xi Jinping, and of China itself. And of course, since being held we've had protests on many campuses in China and quite a few streets. And just today, we've had the announcement of the death of Jiang Zemin. So it's possible that the speakers might touch on some of those issues, or you might want to raise some of them in the questions yourselves. The webinar is organised by the Royal Society for Asian Affairs in the UK. And my name is Bill Hayton, and I'm the editor of the Society's journal, which is called Asian Affairs and comes out 4 times a year. So today we're going to be talking about the Congress meeting that was held between the 16th and the 22nd of October. Party congresses are held every 5 years, and they have a reputation as being events where nothing very much happens. But this year we had some drama with the physical removal of Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao, from the stage in full view of the delegates and the international media. And I'm sure our speakers will be touching on what, if anything, that meant. We have 3 speakers, all of whom are British-based experts in the politics of contemporary China. In alphabetical order, they are Kerry Brown, former British diplomat, now director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. Among his many publications are a biography of Xi Jinping and a recent article on rhetoric in the political language of Xi's China. We also have William Hurst, Chonghua Professor of Chinese Development at the University of Cambridge, who writes on, among other topics, politics and protest in China. And we have Holly Snape of the University of Glasgow, who is editor-in-chief of the academic journal Chinese Law and Government. And the journal is in the process of publishing a special edition looking at developments in Chinese politics and government over the past decade. So all in all, a pretty good group to be looking at the impact of the Party Congress for us today. Now, in reverse alphabetical order, I'm going to ask Holly to start. She has a presentation, and then we'll go probably to Bill and then to Kerry. Is that okay? All right, thanks very much. So Holly, off you go.
Great, thank you very much. Just while I'm sharing my screen here, I'd like to start by saying I'm really sorry if I break out into a coughing fit mid-session. So I was really excited to join everyone today, and so I perhaps unwisely overlooked the fact that I've got this horrible cough, so apologies in advance. So what I wanted to use my time to do is to try to address the theme of this session, which is what did the 20th Congress do that matters? And I'd like to start out by saying at the outset, I think that this Congress, it didn't do anything that was particularly interesting or surprising. But what it did do was to entrench things that we've seen in Chinese politics over the past 5 years, over the past decade, that have been very important and striking. So that's the kind of basic idea that I want to kind of present in the next 10-15 minutes. So what did the Congress entrench? I'm going to argue that it entrenched this remolding of the party within that we've seen over the past decade. And I'll go into some details about that. And the second thing, the set of trends that we've seen in Chinese politics, particularly over the past 5 years since the 19th National Party Congress, is a reset in the party's relationship to its state. And I'll argue how I think that this 20th Party Congress really entrenches that reset. So I wanted to start out by saying something about the Congress report. So one of the key functions of a National Party Congress, just in case, I'm sure many of you will know this already, but one of the key functions of a Congress is to listen to the report of the incumbent Central Committee. And so this report, it's a massive document. It's taken about a year to draft, and it will be studied and implemented by the entire party system, by the civil service, for about a year after the Congress. And so this is a really significant document. And so something that was different about the 20th Party Congress, as compared to 2 decades of top leadership changes, and of course we now know that there wasn't a top leadership change, is that the drafter of the report itself was in the past 2 times when there was a top leadership transition, the head drafter of the report was the incoming general secretary. And the incumbent general secretary would kind of work with or oversee the head drafter. And so the report itself was always a kind of, it was a, in some sense, on a basic level, coming to a kind of general consensus on things. And so it won't surprise you that this time the head drafter, the only drafter was, the only head drafter was Xi Jinping. And so he didn't need to come to any kind of a consensus on what was in the report. And I think that's important to start out by saying, because that meant that this whole document, this really important document that sits at the pinnacle of the Chinese policy process for the coming 5 years, it would have been Xi Jinping who had the power to decide everything from who was on the drafting team to the document's assessment of where China is, the challenges that it faces, the theme of the document, the structure of the document, and so on. So that would have been all directly under Xi Jinping's control. And so in the most direct sense, I see this Congress as a continuation and a deepening of what Xi Jinping already set out in his 19th National Party Congress report. And I think to me, this is why the 20th Party Congress was not really that surprising at all, because it's just a clear continuation of the 19th Party Congress thinking. So to start out with, one thing that I think is really important that this entrenches is the incumbent leader's thought. So I'm going to try and give you 5 entrenchments, 5 things that I think the 20th Party Congress entrenched. And then I'm going to try and walk it back and explain why I think this is an entrenchment of a really important shift in Chinese politics. So the first is that the theme of the Congress this time around was to comprehensively implement Xi Jinping thought, among other things. But that matters because, so since 1997, just after Deng Xiaoping died, Jiang Zemin, who we just heard had sadly died, passed away today. Jiang Zemin, kind of recognizing that Deng Xiaoping had just passed away, he gave his Congress a theme. So he started out the Congress report by saying, the theme of this Congress is to hold high Deng Xiaoping theory. And so ever since then, the Congress has started out, the whole of the Congress has a theme, and the report sets that out. And the theme has been consistently in subsequent documents, upholding the theory of each of the past leaders. And so in 2017, Xi Jinping broke with that tradition. And he jettisoned all mention, all lip service to former leaders' thought. And he said, no, the theme of this Congress in 2017 is to remain true to the original aspiration, right? This time around, the 20th Party Congress, he entrenches that by stating that the whole theme of this 20th Party Congress, which is what we're talking about today, the whole theme of it is comprehensively implementing Xi Jinping thought. And that to me matters. And I think it matters because it entrenches what started in 2017. So Xi Jinping thought was codified in the party charter, the foundational party document in 2017. 2022, that's entrenched. And this matters because it's the first instance in post-Mao China when it's been the incumbent party secretary's body of thought. And that means it's a living, breathing body of sets of ideas that will continue to swell and suffuse policy in ways that I don't think we really fully appreciate or understand yet, that is in play now. And so another thing that's important to recognize about Xi Jinping thought is this is being integrated into the very mechanisms of the system. So you'll see Xi Jinping thought increasingly incorporated into law, for example. I'll give you another practical example in a second of how this is being integrated into the mechanisms of the workings of the Chinese Communist Party system. So the second thing that I think that this Congress entrenches is what we've seen over the past decade is a systematic, comprehensive remolding of the party from within. So in the 20th Party Congress document, the Congress report, it sets out that we will improve the systems and regulations of party self-revolution. And so some people talk about Xi Jinping being the new Mao Zedong. And I think that this is just such a clear kind of concrete example of why that is in some ways so very wrong. Because the way that Xi Jinping approaches managing the party is through rules and mechanisms and documents to kind of systematically try to control the party from within. So what we've seen over the past decade has been this systematic project to create a hierarchy of intra-party documents that kind of mirrors the creation of a legal system inside of the party, right? So it has all of the building blocks of a legal system, rules on legislating, on reviewing intra-party documents, on interpreting them. So at every point in the life cycle of an intra-party regulation, right? This has created this vast system inside the party to regulate the party from within. You don't need to know about the details of this, but the point is that a whole system of implementation has also been put in place. So this creation of a remodeling of how the party operates from within it doesn't just exist on paper. These documents are being implemented. And so what the 20th Party Congress does is it says, we're entrenching this mode of managing the party from within, using documents, using rules, using the party's own mechanisms. So we're not going to manage the party by law, which is something the party always claims to do, but we're going to manage the party using the party's own system of rules and regulations. And so I mentioned that I would come back to why I think Xi Jinping thought is really being integrated into the very mechanisms of the way the Communist Party works. So one example of that is that the party has, over the past decade, it's built up a mechanism to ensure compliance across all substantive party documents through this digitized system of checking every document, every substantive party document that's created nationwide. And one of the things that now checks for, as of 2019, is compliance with Xi Jinping thought. And so the idea that the incumbent leader's thought is alive and well is being integrated into the very kind of workings of the system. The third thing is an expanded notion of party leadership. So I think this 20th Party Congress entrenches this notion of an expanded idea of what it is for the party to actually lead, right? And so the Congress report, it almost says, I'm not going to go into the details of Xi Jinping thought because I've already stated them in prior documents. So go back to those documents and look at what they say. So this is basically what the Party Congress report tells everyone who is studying it. And so the first of those tenets of Xi Jinping thought is to uphold party leadership over everything, right? And so this is a break from the past in Chinese politics, a really important one. So after the Cultural Revolution, after Mao Zedong died, the party went through this long process, kind of 3 years of trying to decide and integrate, like recreate its party charter. So its basic fundamental party rules about what the party's role is in Chinese society. And so one of the things that it came up with was this principle that the party's leadership is principally thought, is political thought and organizational leadership. And in 2017, Xi Jinping broke with that. He changed that. And you've probably heard of this expression, right? The party leads everything. So Xi Jinping stated this in his 19th National Party Congress report, but he didn't just state it in his Congress report, he integrated it into the party charter. So he jettisoned this notion of the party's leadership and replaced it with this idea that the party leads everything. So this kind of expanded notion of party leadership is entrenched by the 20th Party Congress report. And one of the things that the 20th Party Congress report does in expanding comprehensive party leadership is that it states the importance of party center in all of this. So the party centers centralized unified leadership. So I'm not going to go into the details of this because I want to move on to I want to listen to what the other panelists have to say, but I think this is a really important thing that's overlooked, that the party is trying to really institute party center as paramount. So strengthening party centers, centralized unified leadership is about both putting the entire party in its place and telling everyone in the party, you must obey the center in real and practical ways, which has never really quite been the case in the past. And the other thing is about making sure that the party center itself knows its place. So the one thing that happened directly, immediately after the 20th Party Congress, was the Politburo met to discuss how they should practice centralized leadership. So they should report to the party center on important decisions and things. The fourth thing is a reset in the party's relationship to its state. So one thing that the 20th Party Congress entrenches, which I think is deeply important, is, and it sets this out in a new chapter in the Congress report. So the Congress report sometimes signals things that the party places emphasis on by creating a new chapter, so changing the structure of the report. Excuse me. And so the Party Congress report this time around got a new chapter on law. And so what that chapter did was entrench a change on a really deep institutional level in the relationship between the party and the state. And so back in 2017, at the 19th National Party Congress, after Xi Jinping introduced this expanded notion of what party leadership actually means, in the spring following the Party Congress, we saw a constitutional amendment which incorporated party leadership directly into the PRC constitution. So this is the state foundational document, not that of the party. And so this broke, again, with a 35-year pattern of keeping party leadership just in the preamble of the constitution. So this on a really deep level changed the relationship between party and law. And what the 20th Party Congress did was it reasserted that. It basically said, we're not going back on that. We're not changing that. This is here to stay. The party's leadership is established in the constitution. And what I think that means going forward is that we'll see increasingly in new ways the party's leadership being incorporated substantively in state law. Finally, the fifth entrenchment is putting that expanded notion of party leadership into practice. So strengthening comprehensive party leadership in what it says in the 20th Party Congress report, in every field, every element, and every node of governance. And so we saw this happened after the 19th National Party Congress. We had this path-breaking party and government agency reform plan, which melded kind of party and government agencies. It took away functions that had formerly belonged to the government and put them directly under party management. So, for example, basically put the entire civil service directly under party management. So it did really substantive things like this. And what we've seen just before the 20th Party Congress was a new set of a revised set of regulations that basically states the party has power to remove leading officials from right across the entire state system if they show insufficient political ability, for example, if they don't listen to the party as they should, for example. And so what the 20th Party Congress report does is in every field, at every element of governance, it kind of reasserts or reaffirms or entrenches this notion that in every area of governance, the party's leadership should be front and center. I'll stop there. Thanks very much for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Holly. That's great. Well, only one sneeze, I think. Well done. So I think the great thing there, I think, was how you showed the contrast with the predecessors, that this focus on rules as opposed to whim, I suppose, of the leader makes him different from Mao, but the focus on party control of everything makes him different from his more immediate predecessors, and that's what we've seen entrenched. Great. Can I move on to William now? Are you ready to go? And
yes,
from your presentation. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. It's very, very hard to follow that presentation. Honestly, I think Holly's assessment and analysis of the 20th Party Congress is the best that I've seen so far by anybody. And there's not a lot that I really have to add. What I'll talk about is just some of the more substantive policy directions coming out of the Congress, where I think we have seen a bit of change. But I would just underline actually that one of the points that Holly made is that, in fact, Xi Jinping, despite his assertion of kind of personalistic control, is also rather respectful of, and even obsessed with rules and procedures. So this isn't a charismatic kind of leadership that's taken hold. It's something approaching rational bureaucracy, or at least that's what he's going for. He doesn't want to be sort of in the hidebound neo-traditional kind of Brezhnevian framework that I think a lot of people are afraid the party might slip into. But at the same time, he definitely doesn't want a charismatic leadership in the mold of Mao or Stalin, for that matter. And he's really moving for something rather different, and in that sense novel, probably in the history of not just China, but communist regimes around the world. But that being said, to talk about policy for a moment, I do think we've seen some important policy shifts, as well as a couple of important affirmations. So if we just parse the opening speech that Xi Jinping gave on the first day of the Congress, as well as the work report that was submitted, what we find there are almost obsessive focuses and many mentions, hundreds of mentions of the ideas of security and persistence. Right? 坚持 and 安全 come up again and again and again and again. And this comes up with reference to zero COVID and not backing down. There are calls for total mobilization against the virus, for absolute maintenance of the zero COVID set of protocols and general directions. In other words, I think signaling quite clearly that there's no way to climb down from that, regardless of what protests may come over some of those rules. But then also around sort of the general policy line, that we're not going to see a retreat from any of the main agenda items that have been put forward over the last 10 years. But that said, I think there's also an interesting shift away from, or de-emphasis on, a couple of things that had really been central before. One of those is the so-called One Belt, One Road initiative. Right? There was very scant mention of 一带一路in any of those documents or statements, and even less about new plans to add to investment initiatives in that vein, or to really do anything much to expand the program. And in fact, there have been signals elsewhere that the One Belt, One Road program will be scaled back, or is being scaled back in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and certainly with references further afield in Africa or the Middle East. There's less and less of an agenda for promoting those investments and programs. To some extent, that may be being replaced by this Global Development Initiative, which is in some ways perhaps a scaled back set of proposals, but one that is also trying to cast a wider net throughout the world, without so much emphasis on Southeast Asia or Central Asia, as was at least implied by One Belt, One Road. The other interesting thing missing in most of the statements was any real discussion of what's called the 共同富裕 agenda of common prosperity. Right? Almost no mention of that, which to me is a real surprise, particularly given that we all know the economy is in trouble. The government has admitted as much at times during the COVID lockdowns. We all know that economic growth is probably permanently or semi-permanently substantially lower than it had been, especially during the heyday or the boom times of roughly 1994 to 2008. And so in that context, in the past few years, there've been lots and lots of discussion of the need to kind of rebalance the economy to make sure that everyone could enjoy the fruits of this new, basically prosperous society, right? This 小康社会 that the party is so proud of having achieved, and supposedly having eliminated absolute poverty in the process and so forth. Why not discuss that at the party Congress? It really seems as though that agenda of kind of economic leveling up and redistribution has also slid off of the front page, as it were, or been moved very much to the back burner. In its place, we see lots of talk around this global security initiative and a kind of more robust security posture, especially in the region, but even globally, although again, without a lot of detail. So in the midst of much analysis that has focused on the degree to which the Party Congress has enshrined Xi Jinping's individual leadership, has set up a Politburo that is clearly beholden personally to him, Politburo Standing Committee especially, but also the wider Politburo as a whole. And I think the most notable example of that was the almost helicopter promotion of Li Qiang to number 2 on the Politburo after the, in the minds of many people, disastrous lockdowns that he oversaw in Shanghai over the summer. But despite this sort of consolidation of personal authority and sort of unitary power within the party in a tighter and tighter kind of pyramid structure, we're also seeing what I would take to be a bit of a retreat on many policy fronts, or at least less of an advance than would be expected. Various expectations seem to be reined in, whether it's for economic rebalancing, for initiatives in the region, or indeed China's posture on the world stage. I think we're seeing a diminution of ambition rather than an augmentation. And that appears to open up 2 possibilities. One is that Xi Jinping and other top leaders are in fact more concerned about internal strife or possible weakness or threats to continued stability, and they want to refocus on that. Or it could be that they're kind of preparing the ground for some type of much more significant policy shift or initiative to come in the year or 2 ahead. So all of this consolidation of the party structure, of the relationship of the party to the state, of the ability of the party to control not just its own structure and membership, but state officialdom in a very detailed and fine-tuned way, could be deployed in support of some kind of sweeping policy change. And I would not predict that that's going to happen. And I certainly wouldn't want to offer a prediction as to what that might be. But I think it's notable that the groundwork has been laid for that, if indeed Xi and others want to take Chinese politics in a significantly new direction, which I suspect may be in the cards once the pandemic is finally wound down next year, I would hope, in China in terms of the zero COVID rules and all of the reactions around that. If they can get past that, they may actually be launching some kind of new initiative in a different direction. So I'll be very curious to see that, but I won't predict what it is or even for sure that it's coming. And I won't try to parse further the changes to the rules and so on, as Holly's already done a fantastic job of that. And so I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much indeed, William. That's fantastic. Just a reminder to anybody, if you want to ask a question, just type them into the Q&A box in the bar at the bottom, and then we'll take them after Kerry has spoken. So I'll hand over now to Kerry from King's College and also an associate fellow at Chatham House and biographer of Mr. Xi himself. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you. So I couldn't, again, possibly add to what Holly's so masterfully said. And again, William has sort of set the political environment really, really well. I guess I'll say 3 things. I mean, so first of all, just very briefly on Jiang Zemin, we have to recognize that today. One of the sort of great underrated figures of modern Chinese politics, I think. You think of actually what he did during his 13 years in power. He did have a big hand in stabilizing things after the June 89 protests. He did have a big hand in recommitting to open up and reform from the Southern Tour in 1991 too. He was really instrumental in making sure that China handled the Taiwan Straits crisis in 96, which could have gone badly wrong. He reined in the PLA. I think at that time that was our consensus. He got China into WTO just about. He secured the Olympics for China. He was also instrumental in the final few years of Hong Kong, Macau. I mean, these are historic achievements. And I don't think Xi Jinping would make much sense, and China under Xi Jinping doesn't make much sense without recognizing it is a house built on a very firm foundation that Jiang Zemin was so instrumental in. The final thing Jiang Zemin did was, in a scrappy way, but he still did it, he did exit politics, which I think is the hardest thing of all. And I guess that's where Xi Jinping is going to really be tested, because I see no exit route at the moment. We all know in any corporate or government strategy, exiting is the hardest thing. Jiang Zemin is going to be a problem for Xi Jinping, not because there's a Jiang Zemin clique. I think that's long gone. But Jiang Zemin was really about delivery. And I wonder, when I listen to Holly's presentation, I see the architecture and embeddedness of all of the ideas she's talked about, and that's very successful. But where's the beef? Where's the meat in this leadership? What is the great achievement of Xi Jinping? We have the Belt and Road, but as Bill's just said, that's kind of disappeared from the state rhetoric. We've got, you know, a lot of language, which is very impressive, but under Xi Jinping, what is different today than in 2012 in terms of people's daily lives? And it's a bit tougher now, actually. Hu Jintao was the master of growth, GDP growth through your, through your head, basically. The country quadrupled in size under his leadership. So that was a big achievement. Under Xi Jinping, I don't know. I mean, it sort of seems to have made China kind of very contentious, lots of very big issues, but no delivery at the moment. And I wonder kind of whether that's sort of what nags this leadership, and as Bill's alluded to, why we're looking at almost like a war cabinet, you know, a loyalty bolted in for a purpose. We may be about to see some very big surprises. That would make political sense. But I say, as of today, this Xi leadership, there has not been delivery, and Jiang Zemin was definitely Mr. Delivery. Just secondly, about the people. I think it is wonderful to have the analysis that Holly's just made. But my mind is much smaller, and I kind of think of who these people are. I look at them and I wonder, how do they get there? What was their route? How do they get on with Xi Jinping? The other things that I kind of think I know. One is, there is massive competition for these 7 slots, right? I mean, there must be, there are many, 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 many people in the party who have all the qualifications. We know 2 of them, Hu Chunhua and I've forgotten his name now, the other one that, Wang Yang. Wang Yang, well, no, they didn't get the second calling, nor did Li Keqiang, even though he's under the age of 68, so he could have continued. But then we see 4 new people. And it's a bit of a puzzle, really, because they're not stellar, right? I mean, they're not stellar people. Li Qiang, that Bill's just referred to, number 2 in the hierarchy now. No big experience provincially until, I suppose, 2017, when he was briefly in Jiangsu or Jiangxi, and then Shanghai, where he's been party secretary. It's a similar story for Cai Qi, you know, kind of Beijing party secretary in the last 5 years, but before that, you know, mostly kind of political jobs in the party apparatus, significant jobs, but, you know, political, not a massive amount of provincial high-level experience. You got Zhao Leji, you know, yeah, he has a lot of political experience in Qinghai, you know, in the provincial level, but he's really a kind of enforcer and a kind of graft buster, and been very successful at that. And then you've got these figures like Ding Xuexiang and Wang Huning. Wang Huning, the great eminent grease of Chinese politics, the great survivor since 1996, he's the link, okay, the ideas that he has really been so instrumental in promoting. And then Ding Xuexiang, who is really someone with no high-level, substantial political experience beyond being someone who has been close in the last decade and a half to Xi Jinping. People will say, okay, this is the Xi band, you know, the Xi Jinping, you could call it the Fujian band or the Shanxi band, or, you know, what does that mean? I mean, I understand that Xi Jinping worked with Cai Qi in the late 90s in Fujian. I understand that he did work with Cai Qi and also Li Qiang, you know, in Zhejiang for a period. And Li Xi also, I understand Li Xi, you know, has some kind of link with Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father in the, you know, kind of 1980s, you know, but so what? Xi Jinping has had a 40-year career, 50-year career really in the party, or 40 years in the party. He's worked with a lot of people. Why specifically these people? I mean, you know, he must have worked with thousands of people, but this group clearly have something that he believes is important. And looking at what they've said, looking at what people call loyalty, it's very vague. I mean, what is it that they really offer the messages and the mission that Holly and Bill have outlined. So that brings me, I suppose, to the sort of final thing about this mission that Bill has alluded to, and to sort of look a bit at the forward front of things. A lot of people have said this is a leadership which is strong on politics, but no economics. I mean, there's not really an economist there. Li Keqiang had an authentic body of thought about the economy. If you read his, kind of speeches and things in the late 2000s, I mean, it's kind of quite stimulating, thinking about new spaces for growth, thinking about, a new era of reform. With his departure, which is presumably going to happen in March at the National People's Congress, and probably Li Qiang stepping into that position, maybe, then, what is sort of the economic framework? I mean, Holly has given a wonderful presentation about what I think is really significant, the political framework, and it is an enormous amount of effort that's gone into that, and she's very kind of well made out. This is not about necessarily Xi Jinping as an individual. It's not about, kind of making a new Mao era. This is about creating a party that is going to be sustainable and enjoy almost perpetual rule. But beyond that, what are the narratives about the economy? And this brings me to the protests we've been seeing in the last couple of days. And I know Bill has put up some really interesting and important comments on that on Twitter and elsewhere. I mean, looked at, and it would be good to hear your views on this a bit later, Bill. I mean, I think these protests are clearly really significant. And obviously there have been things that some protesters have said that are very significant and extremely political. But also, I just don't think it's as straightforward as saying this is like a Tiananmen Square #2. I mean, not many people would buy into that. But also, I can see also that the party, as it's been doing in the last couple of days, the security services have clamped down. That's inevitable. But I also think that there is clearly something has changed. This message that Holly's just referred to in the party congress that I heard on the 16th of October was about people-centered policy and, the idea of delivery and efficiency of government, efficiency of party service. But clearly those demonstrations were not by people who felt there had been party service or party efficiency and people-centered policy. Just finally, really interestingly, I saw some commentary about in Zhejiang, I believe, a health bureau had produced, I think yesterday, a document which had a strong assertion of people-centered policy. And I think that people-centered policy must have some strong content about economics. And when we think of the immediate 12 to 24 month challenges, that's got to be the key area, right? I mean, if we look at the economics in China, it looks very vexed. I mean, it looks vexed everywhere, but it does look really vexed in China. So I suppose my question that I'm really puzzled by is, we have a strong political narrative, and I think we have a strong political sense of mission. Where does economics figure in that? Because there's one thing that it seems clear about the Xi Jinping leadership in the last decade is it's been quite heedless of the economics in a way. I mean, it's kind of not really thinking a lot about that. That lack of an economic narrative, and again, I'd really love to hear Holly and Bill's views on this, is should we be worried about that? Should we be a little bit anxious? With both of your rich experience of living in China and thinking about China, is that something that is not such a big problem? Or actually, is that going to be the key problem? That we have politicians trying to deal with economic issues, and as Britain has found out in the last couple of months, that usually doesn't end in a great place. If you have a very political approach to budgets and things, it sometimes goes badly wrong. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Kerry, and thank you for kind of bringing us up to speed with what the protests and the death of Jiang Zemin mean for us today. I wonder, Bill, maybe did you have any sort of, maybe you could come back on what Kerry was saying there, maybe then I'll go to Holly after that. I mean, those sort of, you, as Kerry was saying, you have tweeted and written about the protest side. Have you any particular thoughts on that? And then maybe something about the economy as well, if that's something you think you can say something about?
Sure, I can say a bit. There's not really a whole lot new to add on that now. I don't think beyond what's already been said elsewhere. But I think um, the protests really are drawing together otherwise quite disparate strands of discontent and repertoires of contention by workers, by students, by people who are upset about sort of delivery of services and efficiency of government, and by sort of more systemic critics of the regime, of whom there are at least a few. And they've been united under this common framing of anti-lockdown mobilization. And I think the lockdowns perhaps have crystallized in the minds of some the idea that, as Kerry puts it, the state and the party are not delivering very well. They're asking a lot and they're not giving very much. And so I think people are beginning to ask, having done so much for my country, what is my country going to do for me? In a sense, to sort of turn that around. As Xi Jinping calls for ongoing sacrifice and struggle over and over again. He used those words many times in the party Congress and in other speeches in order to confront COVID and confront the current crisis. Eventually, the population will become fatigued of constant crisis. No one can be on this high alert forever. And I think sometimes we underestimate the degree of stress and anxiety produced by this, and also the sort of deep depression, which many people in Chinese society, I think, are feeling as the lockdowns continue into almost the third year at this point. So obviously the effect on the economy of all of this as well is devastating. People cannot go to work, they're losing jobs. Those who are still employed are not always being paid. That's part of the sorts of the labor protests. There are supply chain issues that, among other things, are causing part of our inflation problem here in the UK and elsewhere in the world. Capital is not fleeing China, but I think a lot of people in China with capital are looking to move it out, as they have been for some time. And I don't see a lot of new investment pouring in. And in fact, many people are looking, if not for the exits, at least for alternatives around the world. So things are not looking very good for the economy or for sort of social health in many ways. And I think that it would behoove the party to start thinking more about what Kerry was emphasizing on delivery, and delivery of sort of basic public goods and services that may have been neglected. When you have thousands of people around the country protesting because firefighters can't get to people in a burning building, or because food can't be delivered reliably to residents who are locked inside their apartments. That's not very good delivery, and people are perhaps with some justification pretty angry about that.
Right, thank you. Holly, your presentation was all about trying to get these delivery methods to work. So I wondered if you had anything maybe to reflect on what Bill and Kerry have been saying.
Yeah, on the protests, something that this entrenchment that the party Congress represents, I think that's something that's kind of come up in these protests is that, and this is not true for all protesters, but just sometimes, and something that's I think really quite striking is the mention of the party, the mention of Xi Jinping. So this idea of asking Xi Jinping to step down, the idea of asking the party to step down, and that is really striking. And William is the expert on this, but since the so-called bridge man, before the party Congress, right? A person unveiled a banner across a bridge in Beijing, stating, the things that he wanted, and the things that he didn't want. So these protests have sometimes talked about asking Xi Jinping to step down and asking the party to step down. And I think that so often, in my understanding, protests, dissatisfaction with the party state has been directed towards government, has been directed towards local government, has not necessarily been outwardly like overtly kind of placing blame upon the party or upon the party's central leadership. But the kind of conundrum that the party and Xi Jinping has put itself in is that they have consistently, again and again, stated it's the party that leads everything. It's Xi Jinping that is at the center of this. So you think about these students who are protesting Tsinghua, Peking University at the moment, and all over the country at the moment. They will presumably be taking kind of political classes as part of their university courses, and their political classes are teaching them the thing that you have to know about is Xi Jinping thought. And so, you know, dissatisfaction with Xi Jinping is the kind of is the place that he's put himself in by putting himself front and center, and by putting the party front and center. And the other thing that I think, you know, although the 20th Party Congress wasn't particularly interesting or surprising, it was a moment where I think there'd been a huge build-up to this moment, as there typically is before these big events. And the build-up kind of, you know, it always produces kind of some sort of expectation what will happen at this Congress. And what happened is that there was no overturn, there was no change in direction, this was an entrenchment. And that kind of, you know, in a situation that I think both my fellow panelists have kind of set out, is a really a difficult, problematic situation for the economy, for you know, for employment, for young people. You know, there's a lack of hope. And what this party congress did was it told everybody, we're not changing things, we're just doubling down on this direction. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much. One thing that I think both Bill and Kerry touched on was about the fate of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I had seen something, I can't remember where I saw it, some suggestion that this talk of the Global Development Initiative was about making BRI bigger. And I think, Bill, I think you maybe addressed that. But then you also mentioned the sort of the low mention of of common prosperity as a sort of domestic economic agenda, suggesting that, you know, some of that, you know, kind of equalizing agenda at home may be kind of slipping out of the party's talk. So I wonder if you two could, or maybe the three of you could had some thoughts on that, the kind of the external, you know, kind of China version of development and the internal, I guess, you know, one might call it socialism, kind of inside, you know, kind of an agenda of equality and egalitarianism, the fate of those. Maybe Bill, shall I start with you and then go Kerry and Holly?
Sure, I think it's interesting to see another tweak in the concept, right? That now we're no longer just talking about socialism with special Chinese characteristics, right? Or Chinese special version of socialism. We're talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, or in the new era. And what does that mean, right? I think that means a retreat from principles that could be called socialistic in those earlier formulations. And this idea of common prosperity, as it was articulated a few years ago, made very conscious reference back not to Mao or to sort of older understandings of what a communist society would look like, but rather to the three represents, speaking of Jiang Zemin and his contributions politically, right? His sort of signature ideological or conceptual innovation was in fact this idea that was kind of poo-pooed at the time and not taken very seriously by a lot of people looking from the outside. But I think the third of the three represents that the party and the state must act to represent the general interest of the great majority of Chinese people, is the foundation of common prosperity. Now, The rub there is really, you know, does that mean that a rising tide lifts all boats and we don't really have to worry that much about egalitarian reform? And I think the implication until quite recently was no, they actually do want to rein in the top end and lift the bottom end faster and try to reduce inequality as measured by Gini coefficient or other basic measures. But now it seems like there might be a bit of a retreat from that and a move towards a more sort of macro or top line emphasis on, as long as the economy is growing and everyone is doing better, will tolerate a higher degree of inequality than perhaps we'd signaled we'd be willing to countenance even just 6 months ago.
Kerry?
Yeah, no, I don't really have anything to add apart from one thing. Thinking about Jiang Zemin today again, I'll get my mind off him eventually. Is what I find really weird about the Xi Jinping kind of leadership is not what we see, what we don't see. So if you remember, I mean, Bill will probably remember this, at the late Jiang Zemin era, you know, there was that kind of tension between him and Cao Shi, you know, and then he was kind of got out of the Politburo, I think he was. I don't know if he was in the standing committee, maybe he was, maybe the Politburo, but, you know, he kind of then started leaking. Well, the rumor was that he started leaking stuff to, oh God, was it Willy Lam? You know, and Willy Lam at that time, I think was working for the South China Morning Post, and he had some really interesting stories about the inside fights in elite politics, and it turned out, you know, some of it was pretty accurate. And we have none of that now. You know, where is the opposition? So if you remember this sort of dramatic moment when Hu Jintao sort of kind of left the stage in that very symbolic moment, and everyone was terribly excited by this and felt that this, you know, kind of indicated a massive fissure in the leadership. But again, I kind of, in thinking about it, I can see that symbolically it was a really sort of amazing thing to see that. I mean, you know, you never see within this black box. And then for a second, you had that kind of image of, you know, these impassive leaders, most of them apart from Li Jiangshu, sitting there, you know, just doing nothing while this guy was being sort of led from the stage, looking quite distressed. You then had the, I think a Japanese news analyst sort of saying that he could lip read, and that Wang Huning had said to Li Jiangshu, you know, it's already sorted out, just leave it, you know. And so there seemed to be political meaning to that, not just that Hu Jintao was, you know, kind of, he's not in great health and he may have dementia. We don't know. I mean, it's hard to sort of judge this, but I think I was interested in that because there has been nothing apart from that, you know. I mean, no real sign of any of the elite leaders actually, you know, kind of dissenting. And that itself is really weird because in Deng Xiaoping's era, there was dissent. Yeah, I mean, there were many people who didn't agree with him, including 2 or 3 party secretaries who were then, you know, felled. Mao Zedong period, despite colossal costs, he did not have unopposed leadership, even right to the end. You know, Jiang Zemin, as I said, with Cao Shi, and then Hu Jintao with Wen Jiabao, you know, a little bit of debate at the end of his time about democracy. But it's so weird to have a Xi Jinping leadership where, as of now, you don't have any of that kind of evidence that there is some disagreement. There must be, I presume. I mean, it's not like China has got less easy to govern and less complicated. It's more complicated than ever. And yet you have this still center where nothing seems to stir. And as Holly just said, you know, it's just bored us into submission. I mean, we look with this sort of, you know, kind of leadership transition or leadership consolidation. It's like kind of autocracy by timetable. And I just sort of wonder how, you know, I mean, I suspect there must be some fairly intense debates within. If there aren't, I'm even more worried, because that means a kind of decisiveness which probably is not going to be subtle enough to deal with the very complicated you know, questions that China's dealing with. In any way, this absolute stillness at the center, to me, is deeply, deeply unnerving. Whatever else it is deeply unnerving.
Great, thank you very much. So Holly, over to you. Maybe some thoughts on what happened with Hu Jintao, if you have any, and maybe some other thoughts. This might be the last comment, I think, of the webinar. Thank you.
No pressure then, thank you.
Sum it all up.
So on Hu Jintao, so actually I'd like to pick up on a thread that I think Harry's started out here about kind of the problem of kind of we can't see into the system, right? We can't see into, you know, whether or not there's dissatisfaction with certain policies, the way things are being taken. One reason that I kind of, in the research that I've been doing recently, try to look at this relationship between the party and the state. And you might say that that's totally counterintuitive, because the party is being, you know, the party's kind of eaten up a lot of the state. It's taken away a lot of state functions. It's taken over a lot of things, powers that the state used to have. And that in itself, you know, the thing is that in the study of Chinese politics, we haven't typically kind of had even the language, the heuristics, the grammar to kind of think about the relationship between the party and the state. But only now, kind of retrospectively, we realize that that's a problem, because we can't see when these things are undergoing really deeply important changes. And so one thing, you know, with the change in the top level of leadership and kind of getting rid of Li Keqiang, getting rid of Wang Yang, but particularly getting rid of the current state council head, you know, that used to maybe be some sort of, you know, the state council had its like important functions as a government body, as a government entity. And something that kind of is a trend that strikes me as really worrying is not just whether or not there's kind of there's disagreement within the party, which we would never expect to see anyway, because of the Leninist system of democratic centralism, right? Once a decision is made, you don't publicly contradict that decision. But is potential kind of just bemusement and dissatisfaction throughout the state system. And so an example of that would be, we've talked a lot about Jiang Zemin and his thinking. So one thing that he put into kind of the party canon, I want to say it was in 1997, was this idea of ruling the country by law. So we've heard Xi Jinping talk a lot about that, but it was set out in, I think, the 15th Party Congress. And there was a whole load of debate after that about what that meant for how to rule the party, and whether that meant ruling the party by law, you know, whether it meant creating laws that actually caged in the party. And there is no discussion of that today. And in fact, we even saw, you know, the Wang Qishan in, I think it was 2017, stating at an annual session, there is no separation between party and state. There is only division of labor between party and state. So it's not a conversation that we can have, whether or not there's some kind of it's do not talk about it, basically. But so what in the state system, of the legal system, the people who create laws and legal regulations, what do they feel about this increasing impingement on their field by party documents that kind of incorporate themselves within, you know? So this brazen stating of the party's leadership in the constitution of the PRC, which goes against something that has remained consistent for 35 years, just, you know, there is, so you can see on a certain level in kind of the Chinese literature on all of these developments, you can see that there's kind of worries about how that works in practice, right? So lawyers who work on law, who are thinking about what it means to integrate party documents with laws, for example, you can see on that level. So on a really fine-grained level, when it comes to actual integration of party and state, you can see that stuff. But Kerry's very much right. Like, we don't see sort of disagreement on top level policy, and that's these are worrying trends.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So thanks to our three speakers, to Kerry Brown, to William Hurst, and to Holly Snape. And thank you all participants and attendees for coming. The RSAA's next event will be an in-person event on Wednesday, the 7th of December, about the Afghan province of Nuristan, and details are on the website rsaa.org.uk. On the 13th of December, we have an online discussion for members only about how Kazakhstan gave up nuclear weapons with the author of a book on the subject. And on the 18th of January, in the new year, we're going to have a talk about the Kurdish revolt in Iraq during the 1920s. Again, details on the website. So thank you again to the participants and for everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and see you again. Bye-bye.